Hello and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Nick Blumberg. Brandis Friedman has the evening off. Here's what we're looking at. The Department of Justice is dismissing immigration court judges. We hear from some of them and their concerns over the administration's expedited deportations. How long incarcerated people in Illinois are spending in solitary confinement. We dig into some new data. And the city's top lawyer on legal battles with the Trump administration, ethics reforms, and police misconduct settlements. First off tonight, in just the past week, the Trump administration has abruptly fired some 17 immigration court judges across the country, including here in Chicago. That's in addition to the 50 immigration court judges who have been terminated in the past 6 months, according to the union that represents them. They say the firings are without cause and against the public interest. Joining us now with more on what it means for the country's immigration system are Judge Jennifer Payton, who was fired earlier this month from her position as Assistant Chief Judge for Chicago's Immigration Court, Judge Christy Nelson, who resigned from her position as a Chicago Immigration Court judge in April, and Judge Carla Espinoza, who had her position as a Chicago Immigration Court judge terminated last week. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having us.
Judge Payton, I'd like to start with you. You were on the bench for about 9 years. Yep. How did your experience during the first several months of the current administration compare to the first Trump administration?
So when, starting in January of 2025, there was an abrupt change. Notably on Inauguration Day, Martin Luther King Day, when 4 of the top leadership in the courts nationwide, all women, were fired by email on a federal holiday. And once that happened, everyone kind of braced themselves in the courts, because if that was so swift and so powerful to decimate the agency, what was going to happen next? Over the course of the next several months, more groups of judges were fired, including 7. At my level, I supervise the Chicago courts, so 7 other supervisory judges were fired February 14th. So it's just been a complete decimation of leadership through terminations that were without cause, and also through reassignments of other senior staffers to the Attorney General Task Force on Sanctuary Cities. It's been brutal.
So certainly this was something you saw happening with your colleagues. Did you specifically have any warning you'd be terminated?
I had no warning. I like to say I don't know why I was terminated. I know why I wasn't. I wasn't terminated for cause. I had no performance concerns. I had outstanding performance reviews, as a matter of fact. I received a director's award. I had been part of a pro bono working group, a law school working group. I had been I brought to DC to train you in person for the end of your training. So I was part of a leadership team that was working to make our agency better. And then I slowly saw the members in that leadership team be transferred or fired.
Yeah, so something of a shock, I would imagine, yeah.
Horrible, yes.
Judge Espinoza, what was your reaction when you found out that you were being let go?
I was on the bench when I found out. I was in the course of rendering an oral decision in a case, so I was doing my job until the very last moment. And so, of course, it was shocking to find out in that way, particularly when I was doing a job that I understood to be efficient, fair, uniform across the country, and that was my understanding that that's what an ideal judge should be doing, and I was doing just that. My numbers, performance reviews were outstanding. We hear the ideal judge should adjudicate approximately 700 cases a year. My first fiscal year, I adjudicated over 1,000 cases. I was praised by government attorneys, the private bar. I had reviews by my chief judge at the Chicago Immigration Court. So it was not a performance issue. There was no stated reason, and that made it even more difficult for me.
Judge Nelson, for your part, you chose to resign. How did you come to that decision?
I would say that I saw kind of the writing on the wall. As Judge Payton mentioned, there were a lot of changes in January 2025, not just with people being terminated, but also just the work environment became kind of toxic, and not because of the colleagues, not because of my colleagues in Chicago, but just because of the messaging that we were getting from the top and the constant barrage of emails and memos about federal workers, being lazy or not coming to work, and it just became an environment that I did not want to work in anymore, and I also just did not want to be a part of the changes that were coming in the way so-called justice was being administered.
Judge Payton, some folks might be kind of surprised to hear that an immigration judge can be fired by the Justice Department.
Yes.
If you would briefly explain to us sort of how this court is unusual a bit in its structure.
So what's unusual about the immigration court is that while we are judges and we deal with prosecutors and private attorneys, we don't fall under the judicial branch of government. We fall under the executive branch. This means that we have each been appointed by the Attorney General, and we have all been civil servants. We don't pass Congress because, again, we're not under the judiciary, but rather we are under the executive branch. And I believe that Judge Nelson mentioned that does make it more of a little political at times because we are subjected to other information coming up from headquarters in terms of different priorities. And so as our job as judges to address the priorities from headquarters and do our job completing those.
Judge Espinosa, for many years, judges, attorneys, lots of folks have said the immigration court is severely backlogged. The most recent congressional spending bill, in fact, increases the budgetary allotment for judges. Do you have any sense as to why DOJ is moving to fire certain judges when they're looking to increase their ranks when there is a shortage?
It's inconsistent and it cannot be reconciled. Certainly, if you want an efficient immigration system, you need judges hearing cases, and that's what we were doing. And we were doing it very efficiently at the Chicago Immigration Court. Now the new bill approves for 800 judges. We are at approximately 550. And the previous spending bill authorized 750 judges. So certainly, if you want to be efficient and you want to make immigration a priority, what would be consistent is to have efficient immigration judges hearing cases.
Yeah, Judge Nelson, the Trump administration has been moving for a pretty swift removal of migrants. What kind of an impact had that been having on the immigration court, on sort of the day-to-day functions of it?
Well, I've said that I think the administration is using expedited removal. Well, they're trying to bypass the immigration courts and get to expedited removal, because I think the administration's view is that by doing expedited removal, the respondents don't get the same level of due process. Once a respondent appears in immigration court, the judges are very concerned about making sure that the due process rights are afforded. But by the administration using expedited removal, it's just bypassing the immigration courts, and my concern is that it results in violations of due process.
Well, and could that also, moving at such a quick pace, or sort of putting that pressure from the top, could that affect things like, for example, prosecutorial discretion in how they handle cases?
Well, I definitely noticed a major change in prosecutorial discretion with the change of administration. In the prior administration, the DHS attorneys, who are the prosecutors, they did have discretion to dismiss cases that weren't priorities or to concede certain issues in a case. Once the new administration took over, it seemed like there was the level of prosecutorial discretion was diminished immensely, and it made everybody's jobs harder, and I was concerned about the lack of prosecutorial discretion.
Judge Payton, as we've seen this significant uptick in immigration enforcement, in many cases that's included in courts as well. Was that something that we saw here in Chicago?
We definitely saw the enforcement happen within the courts in Chicago. And I would point out in the spending bill that there's been a great increase in funding for ICE and the removal aspect, but not a similar increase in funding for the Department of Justice courts, right? We work for justice. That's in our agency's name, right? And when you increase funding for enforcement so dramatically, and you don't increase the funding for the immigration courts, it just shows what the values are in that new bill.
Well, and speaking of that increased enforcement, Judge Espinosa, with some of the tactics agents have been using becoming a bit more aggressive perhaps, did that affect turnout at the courts, folks showing up for their cases?
It did. I held both a detained and non-detained docket, and so what I observed doing my non-detained docket is that there was an increased number of respondents who were not coming to court out of fear of being detained. And then I also observed a high number of motions by respondents to appear by WebEx, citing that same fear. So that changed how respondents, their willingness to appear in court.
We've got about 30 seconds left, but Judge Payton, I'd like to ask before we go, what concerns do you have about the state of the immigration court system going forward?
I have concerns for each of us in terms of what we've experienced, but I think a greater concern is what I see as the intentional destruction and weakening of the immigration courts by removing all these judges without cause, and at the same time increasing the number of cases. The people that are going to lose are going to be the respondents, because they won't have the due process and the justice that they all deserve by being present in this country.
Well, I imagine this is something that you all will be paying very close attention to in the coming weeks and months, but that's all the time we have for now. Thank you for joining us, Judge Payton, Judge Nelson, Judge Espinosa.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Up next, why some incarcerated people are spending more than 600 days in solitary confinement.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Some people incarcerated in Illinois prisons are being assigned more than 600 days in solitary confinement. That's despite directives from the Illinois Department of Corrections that cap extended confinement at a year. Reporter Blair Paddock joins us now to break down newly released data. So Blair, what do these numbers from IDOC tell us?
Yeah, so IDOC provided kind of a glimpse into how they implement restrictive housing in the state. Restrictive housing is also known as solitary confinement or segregation. We were given data from April and May. In April, there were over 2,400 restrictive housing placements, totaling over 23,000 days. In May, there was over 2,400 placements, totaling over 20,000 days. And Black people were disproportionately held in restrictive housing. They made up 65% of the instances in May, while making up 55% of the total prison population in Illinois.
Yeah, so a pretty significant disparity there. Why are we getting this information now?
So earlier this year, Illinois passed a law that required IDOC to publicly post quarterly information on its use of restrictive housing. Originally, the bill included actual restrictions on restrictive housing, but I talked to one of the lawmakers that was sponsoring the bill, and they wanted more of a look at, how this is actually being used in the state before bigger policy changes were to come. There are no laws on the books on limiting the use of restrictive housing. There are only internal directives within IDOC. So 28 days for restrictive housing, and then, like you said, a year for extended restrictive housing. So advocates are hoping that once this data becomes available, that maybe legislative action can be taken on restrictions.
Yeah, this is certainly a pretty revealing window into the system. So, for folks who are in restrictive housing, what are the conditions like?
Yeah, folks who have been in restrictive housing talk about its extreme isolation. It puts them in, you can be in small, dark cells, outside contact with tablets and phones. That usage could be limited. Yard and outside time could be limited. Uptown People's Law Center has been litigating over IDOC's usage of restrictive housing for nearly a decade. And when they first brought on the lawsuits, one of the people involved had been in restrictive housing for 17 years.
Wow, certainly a significant length of time there. Blair Paddock, thank you for this reporting.
Thank you.
And you can read Blair's full story on our website. That's WTTW.com/news. The City Council is moving forward with tightening ethics rules to keep the city's top lawyer from intervening in investigations into elected officials, a move that some say is long overdue. After the convictions of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan and former Alderman Ed Burke, Chicago's political scene is falling under renewed scrutiny by those pushing for reform. There's also growing pressure nationally as President Trump targets Chicago with multiple lawsuits. Joining us with more is Mary Richardson-Lowry, Chicago Corporation Counsel. Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Nick, for having me.
When Alderman Matt Martin, who chairs the Ethics Committee, first proposed this measure, you said it was legally deficient. This version that was just approved was hammered out after negotiations between your office and Inspector General Deborah Witzberg. Is this version the right step toward ethics reform?
It is, and I'll tell you, when we said legally deficient, your intro implied that somehow we were an impediment to an ethics work, and that wasn't the case. It was just flawed in terms of how it's presented. For instance, the ethical obligation of a lawyer is to retain attorney-client privilege. That obliterated it. The ethical obligation of a lawyer is to keep work product confidential. That dismantled it. And the ethical obligation of city lawyers is to be able to sit in on interviews when asked, when the city's interests are, that removed it. So this version that passed does none of those things. What it also does, however, is also include ethical obligations of the person whoever he or she happens to be, is leading the office of Inspector General. So now we have both standards for the qualifications of the person. We have professional standards for how one ought to conduct oneself. And we also have a basis for calls for removal if they fail to meet those professional standards. So we think, in the end, it's a good result that started off with perhaps a misguided, as crafted effort.
Well, you mentioned, sort of keeping an eye as an attorney, your obligation to keep an eye on the interests of the city or of folks you're representing. The IG said your office had been involved in probes because of concerns of embarrassment or political consequences. What's your reaction to that?
That was not the case. And perhaps from her vantage point, that was the viewpoint. It just wasn't factual. Attorneys we don't set policy. So distinguish, please. But we do have an obligation to represent the city. We do have an obligation to represent its interests, and that's what the city attorneys have done for a very long time. So I just think that was a mischaracterization, but I view it as an attempt to lift the issue of further evolution in ethics reform. And I think this structure gets us to a place where we don't erode our obligations as lawyers, nor do we have an adverse impact on the Office of Inspector General, who is also a client, and their ability to do their job.
A lot of interests for you to balance there.
Indeed.
And we should note that IG Witzberg just announced that she won't be seeking another term, that she'll be leaving at the end in April. What do you hope to see in her successor?
They will arrive with these guidelines in place. They will arrive with professional standards in place. What we hope to see first is somebody who's ethical and willing to apply that ethics as they go about their job. Again, they're a client. We're there to guide them, give legal support, but to the extent that they fail to meet their obligation, then we have to address that as well.
The IG folks who are focused on reform, they'll point out things like 38 alderpeople convicted since 1969. Obviously a lot of attention given the recent cases of former Alderman Ed Burke, former House Speaker Mike Madigan. There were some who hoped to see ethics reforms sooner rather than, sort of on the timeline we've been on. What's your take on sort of the pace of that?
Well, the bureaucracy being what it is, I'm sure it's never quite at the pace people would like. But I think the ethical reforms are important. Certainly the city of Chicago has had some history with, let's say, malfeasance. And so we believe that ethical, having an ethics ordinance, having a OIG department, and supporting its ability to do its job is not antithetical to good lawyering. So both are necessary. It's not an either or.
We mentioned, the Chicago Police Department earlier. We're 7 months into the year. The city has spent at least $224 million or so to resolve about 2.5 dozen lawsuits. You've taken a bit more aggressive of approach to resolving some of those cases. Why is that?
It's the fiscally responsible thing to do. I inherited cases that dated back to 2012 that I'm trying to solve for. I also inherited a bunch of cases that were COVID hold. And it costs the city an extra $100,000 on average for certain categories of cases for each year that the can, as the proverbial saying goes, is kicked down the road. That is not the approach of this administration, and it's certainly not my approach. We must meet it head on, and we have done that. So yes, it is true, there are more of them. And yes, it is true that it costs more to do that in the short run, but it is also true that the savings are significant in the long run. So we're on that course. We will continue to look for opportunities to settle. We try cases where we must, but what it means for the taxpayer is they benefit in the end, because for the long term we're not spending as much of the city's resources. We've restructured our insurance tiers to help us to meet that obligation. Frankly, I'm reorganizing parts of the department. We've hired a new head of mass torts and complex litigation. I've put in place a risk manager as a deputy. We have a division that had reverse conviction oversight. I am announcing that I am separating out that division and creating two, one more focused on settlements and mediation. I've just hired, or someone's just agreed to join us, that will focus on settlements and mediation in particular. So you can see where this is going. We are seizing the moment, acknowledging that we have a lot of age cases, COVID holds, a work ahead, but we're getting about doing that work.
Well, to that point about settlements and to how far back some of these cases go, the city's faced hundreds of lawsuits naming just 3 former officers, of course, John Burge, Ronaldo Rivera, and Ronald Watts. So far you haven't seemed to be on board with the idea of sort of a global settlement to resolve as many of those cases as possible.
Au contraire.
Is that something that
Au contraire. Yeah. Invite me back in time. There, of course, we're looking at global settlements. There has to be a judge who will work with us on that. There has to be a plaintiff's counsel who will work with us on that and is willing to sit with us. But there are no, what's the expression? No stones unturned. We are very receptive to global settlements. We're very receptive to partial global settlements. We must pursue structured funding options as well. You will see that we are looking at innovative ways to solve for old problems, and we will.
All right, we look forward to continuing that conversation. The city has been the target of several lawsuits from the Trump administration, everything from sanctuary city laws to threats over diversity, equity, and inclusion. How's your department been responding to those?
Head on. As you know, I went with the mayor to oversight, and we addressed our welcoming city ordinance there with other cities. We have been sued by the Trump administration with respect to the welcoming city ordinance, along with the county relative to their ordinance and the state relative to its Illinois Trust Act. We have responded in court, and all our filings are in. We are waiting for a decision from the judge. We have filed probably just under 40 cases related to this administration. Securing the cities is one such thing, the filing that we had, and what that means is, for the listener, terrorism dollars. Imagine that. Since February, we haven't had any reimbursements for things that help us to address terrorism in the 3rd largest city in the country. That matters to the citizen. So we filed, and just after filing, we were joined by other cities, Denver, San Francisco, etc. And shortly thereafter, suddenly the funds were released. If that is the path we need to travel to ensure the funds are released, the citizens have the protections that they need, and the resources so that the mayor can go about implementing his obligations, that is what we will do.
We've got just about 30 seconds left. You know, the president's also threatened to withhold funds from the city because of policies protecting immigrants. What are your concerns if he does follow through with that?
Certainly we've seen that already, and we have filed litigation accordingly. We've joined other cities as a consequence of that. The idea that funds are held because of an EO, an executive order, that's not appropriate. It's inconsistent with the Constitution, and we will continue to meet the moment, file litigation, and respond legally.
All right, well, that's all the time that we have for this evening, but we'd love to keep the conversation going. Mary Richardson-Lowry, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And that's our show for this Thursday night. If you're looking for some fun this weekend, be sure to check out our summer festival guide for events across Chicago and the suburbs. That's at WTTW.com/festivals. Join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 7 for the Week in Review. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that serves the needs of clients in the Chicago area and throughout the nation.